it to Nature has to be retracted because there's evidence of obvious data falsification, data manipulation. And it turns out it looks like he even plagiarized part of his PhD thesis. So this guy is just, he's another one of these people that's just not an honest operator. Now, this guy had a position at the University of Rochester, and a lot of the money that he got to do this research comes from taxpayers. You know, I don't know exactly the source of all of his funding, but it's impossible for me to believe that at least some of this guy's research was not taxpayer funded, and the likelihood is that it was all taxpayer funded. That's fraud, and I think that you should be answerable for that. If you commit scientific fraud, I don't understand how that's different than any other kind of fraud. You should be tried for that. Now, this is controversial because in the past there have been efforts to keep scientists honest. But it's always on the front end of the process. There's all these people. Every time somebody has tried to come up with a mechanism for making sure that grant monies are spent in more productive, more honest ways, it's always on the front end. So you have these reviewers that are looking over your funding proposals, and they get involved in the minutia of it, and they start to tell you have to do this, you have to do that. That's not a really good way to address this because you do not want to basically tamp down on creativity. Look, when you send in a request for funding, a proposal for a grant, generally you kind of don't know how things are going to go. You know, you're doing research, you're trying to answer questions, and you got to keep an open mind. You don't know in many cases how this is going to turn out, and you do not want to tamp down or discourage people from taking chances. That's what science is all about. You are trying to answer questions, and if you already know what the answer is, you're kind of not doing science. You may be verifying somebody else's result, but you're not really doing original stuff. So you don't want to discourage people from taking risks. That's part and parcel of science. And some of the mechanisms that have been implemented in past to basically keep a watch on things like this haven't worked very well. You get people that really kind of don't know what you're doing, that are looking over your shoulder, and it just stifles the whole process. I personally had this happen to me once. I ran a lab, and one of the things that we needed in a lab was a piece of experimental equipment, and we had all of these people that were involved to make sure that you didn't spend a dime on anything that wasn't completely worth it. And we had bookkeepers and accountants coming into our meetings where we were, you know, talking about the equipment we needed to set up these labs, and I had somebody that had no background in physics whatsoever, no expertise, in my wheelhouse telling me how this piece of scientific equipment that I wanted, he found online somewhere for 1/10 of the price that I wanted it. It was a vacuum tube. Well, vacuum tubes are all different, and these are sort of one-off tubes. And the tube that I needed cost a lot of money for a reason. That there's not very many of them out there, and it does something very specific. But try explaining to that some bean counter, you know. He's going to insist that, oh, no, this one looks like it has the exact same specs when he doesn't know anything about what the specs mean. So that particular method, you know, sort of looking over people's shoulder and, you know, having you jump through a whole bunch of hoops on the front end has already been tried and found, in my opinion, wanting. No, I think what you have to do is make the penalties for scientific fraud or abuse or waste of grant monies to be so severe that it makes people think twice before they do it. The other thing that you're going to have to do is you really got to stop granting so many PhDs. There's just not a reason why the world needs millions of PhDs in some fields. And look, I was a part of that. One of the institutions that I taught at, where I was at for nearly a quarter of a century, at one point we had almost 100 people in a graduate program for a really small institution. There's just not jobs, there's not positions, there's not a need for that many PhDs in physics coming from this one small school. Now, they weren't all PhD students, some were master's students, but the point is, you're putting all these people out there with advanced degrees, and there's just not enough need for that in the world. Right now, if you want to get a PhD in physics and you want a faculty position, you know, you're looking at years and years and years of doing postdocs for low pay, you know, sleeping in your car, sleeping in your office before you ever get a tenure track position anywhere. You got to really think carefully about if that's what you want to do. And when you start dumping lots of PhDs into scientific fields, that's when the temptation, if you are a tenure track professor, in order to get tenure, you got to publish a lot of stuff. You have to be really productive. And they have productivity defined in many ways by how much research you do and how many papers that you publish. Teaching and service, which used to be components of that, at least at the places I've been, after a while, they didn't matter anymore. They want to know how much money you were bringing in. By the way, the answer to what ails scientific research and why there's so much scientific fraud anymore is the same as what ails everything else. It's money. Right now, if there were sufficient funding for a flat earth institute, there would be such institutes at most universities in this country. That's just the way it works. If there's money out there to fund something, it doesn't matter how silly it is, people will get involved in it. So I think this guy, Ranga Diaz, he committed fraud. It's blatant fraud, okay? If you did that in the business world, you'd be in the hot seat. Somebody would have you in a court and you'd be prosecuted for it. Why should science be any different? Now, again, you got to be a little bit careful. In science, it's awfully easy to pursue something that in the end just doesn't pan out. I'm not for punishing that. That's part of science. Not everything you do works. If you're honest about it, a lot of times when you try to do something, you say, oh, well, the system does not behave the way that I thought that it might. You've done the world a favor there because you've eliminated one possibility for maybe how you think things work. That's very useful. So a null result in an experiment is sometimes quite valuable. In fact, one of the most famous null results in history was luminiferous ether, right? And when people found out finally there was no luminiferous ether, that's when Einstein stepped in and came up with the concept of space-time for the medium through which light traveled. So a null result is okay. It's when you are trying to falsify data, when you are trying to manipulate data to say something that it doesn't say. That's fraud. And again, there's two ways of not telling the truth. One way is not really knowing what the truth is, trying to fumble through it. You make mistakes. The other way is to lie about things. And what I used to tell all of my students, undergraduate and graduate students, is I don't care if you make a mistake. Mistakes are part of life. The world is an imperfect place, and so is the universe. So if you make a mistake, that's fine. Just cop to it. Say, I made a mistake. It's when you exhibit an intent to deceive that I have a problem. That's always how I define plagiarism, too. If you came to me with a thesis or a senior project or even a lab report, and I found something in there that looked to me like it was plagiarized, and it just looks to me like you made a mistake, and people do that. They don't attribute things correctly. They accidentally left out a quote. That happens. Things like that do happen. People do make honest mistakes. There is such a thing called an honest mistake. Nobody's perfect. I always define plagiarism as intent to deceive. If I think you did it on purpose, you were trying to pass off this as your work when it's somebody else's, that's when all of a sudden you and I were not going to get along anymore. And I think that's the same in science. If you